In my last video, I talked about Peter Gabriel in Bath in 1974. This one, I want to go back about 110 years earlier to September 1864. And this is on the eve of a great debate, an anticipated great debate between Speke and Burton. The debate was taking place at a moment in time during the Victorian era that was just the height of the British Empire. At this point in time, the American Civil War was nearing its end. Jules Verne had just published the most Victorian of all novels, Journey to the Center of the Earth. It is truly the age of the Victorian explorer, the time of proper adventures, the kind that make you think of leather steamer trunks, mutinies and backstabbing guides in the jungle, and poisoned arrows, adventures with charging elephants. It is also an age of science and reason. Just a few years earlier, Charles Darwin had published his theory of evolution. When I moved to England some years ago, I wanted to learn about British history, so I picked up the Pax Britannica Trilogy by Jan Morris, written in the late 1960s to the late 1970s. And there's 3 books. They are quite a read, but they are incredibly readable and have many great stories in them. And it was from the first book, Heaven's Command, that in chapter 14, that I first heard the story of Speke and Burton. And Jan Morris is an amazing storyteller. So I highly recommend these 3 books, with one minor warning that she is very pro-empire. Well, the members of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which includes the Royal Geographical Society, held their annual convention in Bath on this particular week in September. It was a big deal for Victorians. All the newspapers covered the events around the clock, including details of dinner parties and fancy balls. J.M. Stewart was there. He was the first man to traverse Australia from top to bottom. So was Henry Bates, who discovered, at least to the British, thousands of species of butterflies, hoverflies, dragonflies, and other fauna during his many years exploring the Amazon. And so was the most famous Victorian explorer of all. I'm talking, of course, about the then 51-year-old Dr. David Livingstone. He was famous for his daring-do explorations of Africa. In one adventure, a lion took a bite out of his shoulder. He was said to be able to convert a threatening tribal chief into a close friend with the, quote, simple jab of the barrel of a revolver. Well, Dr. Livingstone had opened the conference a few days earlier with a toast saying that the stories of British exploration were communicated to the world. In other words, that British discoveries were not for Britons. They were first and foremost on behalf of all mankind. And during the conference, he stayed as a guest at the beautiful and stately house number 13, the Circus. This is the Circus here in Bath, and this is number 13. I think it looks very much the same today as it did when he was there. But even Livingstone's fame was overshadowed by what was scheduled for the afternoon of September 16th, 3 p.m. For the climax of this convention was the first public meeting in over 5 years of 2 warring English explorers of Africa at the Royal Mineral Water Hospital in the center of Bath. The hospital building is still there, although it's currently unused. Now, their dispute was over whether one of them had or had not discovered the crown jewel of Victorian exploration, the source of the River Nile. And Dr. Livingstone was to play the role of moderator in this debate. It was an event that held Britain's rapt attention. But it was also never to take place, because the events of the hours of the prior day would leave one of those two explorers dead. Now, these two explorers started out as colleagues, although incompatible ones, perhaps. They met 10 years earlier in 1854. The source of the White Nile was believed to start from a high peak or a natural spring somewhere in the African interior. And so it was that these two explorers, starting in that year, Richard Burton, who was 33 then, and John Hanning Speke, who was 27, set out together to solve this mystery. I'll share their story while showing some maps and drawings from the Bodleian Library, which are in the archives of Horace Waller, who wrote about Africa and Dr. Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone gave him his materials to publish. But it really is one of the most incredible stories, and worth taking a couple of minutes as well to talk about these two characters. Richard Burton, an Oxford dropout. He went to India, rose through the ranks of the East India Company as an interpreter, learning Hindustani, Farsi, Marathi, Turkish, Arabic, and apparently over 20 other languages over the course of his life. Bram Stoker met him and remembered him later. His canine tooth showed its full length like the gleam of a dagger. He was dark and forceful. So perhaps with some of Burton in mind, Bram, of course, would go on to write the vampire novel Dracula. Richard Burton was possibly the first Englishman to enter Mecca, disguised as a Muslim, by dyeing his skin with walnut juice. Although this is the story anyway. I'm personally a hair skeptical of it. There's no reason to share exaggerations of his life. There's plenty of incredible stories already. But anyway, that was Richard Burton prior to the African explorations. He heard stories from Arabic traders of an immense inland lake in Africa, which was yet unknown to the English. He thought, could this be one of the sources, or the source of the White Nile? The Nile River was considered to be the longest in the world, emptying into the Mediterranean at Cairo. But the question was, where did it start? As you followed the Nile upstream, it branches off so many times. It wasn't clear which of the branches was the main one. Many of the branches are choked with grasses and weeds, and it was just impossible to journey upstream in them by boat. The White Nile was the longest stretch into the middle of Africa. Burton was in Aden, in modern-day Yemen, about to kick off his exploration of East Africa when one of his expedition party died. Looking for a last-minute replacement, he found a young British officer, John Speke, who came from an upper-class background and happened to be hanging around on his way to go big game hunting, and he roped him in as a replacement. Now, Speke had little interest in this expedition and even fewer skills to bring to it, but he joined them, and their first exploration was a disaster. They were attacked by 350 Somalis. Speke was hit with a spear through his thigh, Burton a javelin through his back teeth, cheek to cheek. They made it back to the boat and were lucky to escape alive. There's so many stories from their explorations. I highly recommend Candice Millard's River of the Gods, which is an absolutely thrilling read. She also wrote a book on Winston Churchill that I'll reference in a later video. Anyway, the two of them, having had a disastrous first journey in Africa together, were back at it in early 1857 and were officially looking for the source of the Nile. By February, they made it to the Pangani River. Burton wrote poetically in his journal one night, "All around reigned the eternal African silence, deep and saddening, broken only by the curlew scream or by the breeze rustling the treetops, whispering among the matted foliage. We sat under a tree till midnight, unsatiated with the charm of the hour. The moon rained molten silver over the dark foliage of the wild palms. The stars were as golden lamps suspended in the limpid air, and Venus glittered diamond-like upon the front of the firmament. Well, by mid-1857, they set out for Lake Tanganyika. Through East African kingdoms, on jungle paths lined with cocoa trees and wild hibiscus, in the rain and through delirious fevers, their caravan followed a path dotted with mango trees, which were grown from seeds spit out by Arabian slave traders who ate cases of mangoes they brought with them as they forged these paths over the years and years, leading their own human caravans to the coast. Of Burton and Speke's expedition, men deserted, and they had to recruit new men. At one point, they numbered 132 interpreters, cooks, soldiers. By February 1858, they reached Lake Tanganyika, the first Europeans to visit it. But it was too low to be the source of the Nile. And already sick and exhausted with malaria and at times completely blind, paralyzed, carried in hammocks, their hired staff abandoning them, they settled down in a nearby town to recuperate. In June of that year, Speke, who was younger and had already been sick the longest, had mostly recovered. So he took 50 men and set out alone to visit a large lake that they'd heard about. A beetle crawled into Speke's ear on this trip, which he unsuccessfully tried to reach with a penknife. So for a while he was both blind, partially blind, and deaf in one ear. His face was paralyzed, he added later. And the inflammation in his ear drew some of the inflammation away from his eyes. But a month later, in this state, he reached the tropically warm lake that they'd heard about, glistening in the sun with uncountable miles of shoreline. The spray of waves and the small verdant islands. In honor of his queen, he named it Lake Victoria. Of course, the locals already had a name for it. They call it Lake Nyanza. Well, he looked around for 3 days, and though he couldn't find a specific connection to the Nile, he was sure Lake Victoria was the source. So he hurried back to Burton. And Burton picks up the story in chapter 16 of his memoirs, The Source of the Nile, and he says, "At length my companion had been successful. His flying trip had led him to the northern water, and he found its dimensions surpassing our most sanguine expectations. We had scarcely, however, breakfasted before he announced to me the startling fact that he had discovered the source of the White Nile. It was an inspiration, perhaps, the moment he sighted the Nyanza. He felt at once no doubt but that the lake at his feet gave birth to that interesting river on which has been the subject of so much speculation and the object of so many explorers. The fortunate discoverer's conviction was strong. His reasons were weak. In other words, Speke had gone on, found Lake Victoria, announced that it was the source of the Nile. Burton wasn't so sure. Well, so who was right? Well, mostly Speke. The Nile has many sources, and Lake Victoria itself is fed by some springs and a river. So they could all be considered the source. But Lake Victoria is considered today the primary source of the Nile. Burton at the time thought that Lake Tanganyika might be the source, and that was wrong. But he was right about one point. His main argument with Speke was that Speke had no proof, yet was about to claim his discovery as definite. So bickering all the way back, they headed north to present-day Djibouti, and then across the Red Sea to Yemen. And from there, a steamer would take them back to England. Speke went first, while Burton stayed to recover and regain his strength. According to Burton, Speke told him as he was leaving that he would wait until Burton joined him before going to the Royal Geographical Society together. But of course, Speke, upon returning to England, couldn't contain himself, declaring victory on his first day back at home. And by the time Burton arrived weeks later, the time for thoughtful discussion had passed. Plans were already underway for Speke to take a victory lap of Africa, during which he also stumbled upon another lake and named Lake Albert after Queen Victoria's husband. So that's what happened 5 years earlier. And back to the occasion of the conference, the debate. Burton and his wife were staying in Bath for it, and Speke stayed at with his cousin at his cousin's country estate in Neston Park, about 10 miles east. The great debate was scheduled for the following afternoon, and on September 15th, then these two men met in the Mineral Water Hospital to reunite. And this is the Mineral Water Hospital. It's still there today. It stands mostly overlooked in the center of the main crossroads in downtown Bath. Well, the men met, but they didn't speak. Burton's wife, Isabel, said Speke's face was full of, quote, sorrow and yearning. And after a while, he said, "Oh, I can't stand this any longer." He got up and left. A man near him asked if he'd be back, and "I hope not," was the reply. Of course, Speke at this time was still half blind and half deaf. Speke took his horse, headed back to his cousin's property. He went out with his cousin into the fields that they both knew really well, looking for partridges to shoot. So around 2:30 that afternoon, Speke's cousin heard the sound of a shot and saw Speke, having climbed on a stone wall, falling from it. He'd been shot in the chest and died on the spot. "The charitable say he shot himself, the uncharitable that I shot him," Burton later said. On the site of this tragedy, there is a small memorial. It says, "Here lies the distinguished and enterprising African traveler, Captain John Herring Speke, lost his life in the accidental explosion of his gun." You can visit the spot today. It's in the middle of a field. There's no parking or signage. I parked on Wadswick Lane in a small lay-by at the edge of a public bridle path, and then walked west and south along a right-of-way to reach it. Well, a year later, verification that they'd found the source of the Nile still eluded the Royal Geographical Society, so they commissioned Dr. Livingstone to lead another journey to Africa. He was in his early 50s at that time. He lost his medicine, his supplies were looted, was surrounded by warring tribes, and got very sick, and spent a long stretch in the town Ujiji, withering under a white beard and trying to recover his strength. He, at this point, had lost everything and was largely forgotten about. And, forgotten about at least until a very famous moment 6 years later, when a reporter for the New York Herald goes looking for him. So with a long caravan, entourage carrying tents, trunks, rations, and all the accoutrements of high Victorian travel, winding his way to Dr. Livingstone, led by a beaming Henry Stanley, finally finds him and valiantly trying to hold in his excitement, stands before him and utters the most famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Well, Dr. Livingstone recovered with the help of Stanley's supplies, and he headed off to complete his mission, although he died a few months later. Stanley went home to celebrate his victory of finding the most famous explorer, and then planned his own trip to settle the Nile question for himself. He came back to Africa, reached Lake Victoria, traveled all the way around it, and proved that it was not fed from any other source. In other words, that Speke was right after all, and that Lake Victoria was the definitive source of the Nile. Richard Burton lived many more years and made a small fortune publishing translations of Arabic texts, including the first full-length English translation of the book Arabian Nights. Well, thanks again to Candice Millard and her book, River of the Gods. If you want to hear more about Peter Gabriel and how Bath inspired him, see my last video. In the next one, I'll stay on the theme of Victorian-era science and debate. That is in the summer of 1860, just after Speke and Burton had returned to England with stories of their expeditions. The second most electric debate of the Victorian era came to Oxford. See you then.